The envelope was the color of dried blood. It sat there under my windshield wiper, a slash of crimson against the night. My sister's handwriting, elegant as always. I warned you not to humiliate me. I stood beneath the street lamp outside the Fairmont in San Francisco, my breath clouding in the cool spring air, and knew without opening it what waited inside. Not another threat, not an insult. Something worse. War. Legal and cruel. My name is Maria Howard, and 12 hours ago I watched my younger sister take credit for 20 years of my work while my husband stood beside her, his hand resting on her back like it belonged there. Now they wanted to take the last thing that mattered. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the court document. The words swam before my eyes. Emergency motion request for temporary custody of minor. Mental instability, emotional neglect, unfit parental capacity. They were trying to take my son, Michael. I pressed my father's rosewood pin into my lapel, my fingers tracing its familiar shape. The same pin Andrew had given me when I received my first funding grant 20 years ago. The pin Caroline had once called cheap, telling me not to wear it to donor meetings. This is war, I whispered, tucking the summons into my purse. No, this was accounting, and I was about to balance the books. Flashback of the gala. The ballroom of the Fairmont glittered with crystal and wealth. I'd stepped through those doors, clutching a small silver box wrapped with a dusty blue ribbon, a bracelet for Caroline, pale aquamarine set in gold. Her birthstone. It wasn't expensive, but it carried a quiet weight. Like me. Hey, Maria, someone muttered with a distracted half smile as I passed. I nodded back, unsure if they were actually speaking to me or simply acknowledging my presence out of obligation. 20 years I'd spent building Hemlock educational software from nothing. 20 years of innovative coding, educator consultations, 16-hour days. The invitation to this gala, celebrating the 20th anniversary of our educational foundation, had my name listed as host. Yet now I stood at the entrance, invisible at 57, while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. I wore my mother's pearl brooch on the collar of my navy wrap dress. Simple, modest. I hadn't bought anything new for the event. Truth be told, I hadn't planned on coming at all. Something in me, perhaps old duty, perhaps the last shred of hope after 25 years of marriage, had pushed me through those doors. I spotted Caroline across the room, radiant at 54 under the chandelier I'd paid for. Thomas, my husband of a quarter century, stood beside her, his hand placed too familiarly on the small of her back. I found an empty spot near the drink table and took a sip of water, not wine, not tonight. I told myself I was just here to celebrate, to smile, and to leave early. No trouble, no fuss. That promise shattered 10 minutes later. Ladies and gentlemen, announced a voice from the stage, a special speech from our visionary founder, Caroline Howard. Founder? My fingers tightened around the water glass. The Educational Foundation had been my brainchild, born from countless nights working with underprivileged schools when Michael was just starting elementary school. Caroline took the stage in a sequin gown that caught the light like ice. Thomas stood nearby, beaming with pride as though her accomplishments were somehow his creation too. As she began speaking, I heard my words, phrases from grant proposals I'd written years ago, statistics I'd compiled during sleepless nights, coming from her mouth as though she'd thought of them herself. When I started this foundation 20 years ago, she said smoothly, people told me technology couldn't bridge the education gap. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. 20 years ago, Caroline had been pursuing her third failed business venture while I coded our first educational program during Michael's nap times. That's when I saw it, the pearl brooch. Not on my collar. On hers. My throat went dry. That brooch. I had handed it to Caroline last Christmas when she cried and said she missed Mom. I'd wrapped it in tissue paper, told her it was a symbol, something to keep us connected to Eleanor, our 82-year-old mother, too frail now to attend events like this. But Caroline never believed in symbols. She believed in ownership. At home the discovery, I drove through the quiet streets of Austin with both hands steady on the wheel, though nothing else about me felt steady. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. Thomas's name flashing repeatedly. No voicemails. Just calls. I didn't answer. I didn't even turn it face down. I let it blink, fade, then blink again, like some pathetic flare from a man who knew the ship was sinking but still acted surprised. The yellow glow of streetlights blurred into streaks as I passed. I wasn't crying. I hadn't cried all night. It wasn't numbness, it was preservation, as if even my tear ducts knew I needed to keep everything contained until I was safe. But the images kept cycling through my mind like a broken film reel. Caroline's manicured fingers adjusting my mother's brooch on her collar, Thomas's hands settling too low on her back, that smirk they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. My husband wasn't born wealthy. There was a time, early in our marriage, when he'd stay up late helping me code, amazed at the educational software I was developing. "You're brilliant, Maria," he used to say. That was before the first million, before the investors, before he started introducing himself as the strategic visionary of our company at parties. Before Caroline, recently divorced and suddenly interested in educational philanthropy, began stopping by our office with lunch for Thomas. By the time I turned into our cul-de-sac, most homes were dark. Our porch light was off. Thomas's car wasn't in the driveway. Inside our home of 18 years, everything looked the same, too much the same. Family photos on the wall, Thomas and I at Michael's high school graduation 3 years ago, all smiling as though we were actually happy. I kicked off my shoes and dropped my clutch on the console table by the door. As I passed the hallway, I noticed his weekend bag was gone, the larger one, the one he used when we went to Sedona for our 20th anniversary. And the drawer where he kept his spare car keys was cracked open, empty. I checked my phone again, this time with purpose. One new voice memo, not from Thomas, but from Caroline. I sat on the edge of the couch before hitting play. Her voice was syrupy, slurred just enough to betray the champagne. "You were never meant for him, Maria. You were just a placeholder until he found someone who could really help his career." There was a giggle, muffled music, the clinking of glasses. "I mean, come on, you saw us tonight. It's like we finally got to stop pretending." The message ended with the sound of someone calling her name in the background. Thomas, undoubtedly. I stared at the wall for a full minute, at the framed photo of my father Andrew on his 70th birthday, 10 years ago. He'd been a professor of education, the one who first encouraged me to develop learning software. "Always keep records, Maria," he used to say. "Documentation is power." I forwarded the voice memo to both my work email and my backup drive, saving it to the cloud under a new encrypted folder named "For Later." When I stood, I noticed the silence, a kind of quiet that didn't belong in a house where two people had lived for nearly 2 decades. I walked through the living room and down the hall toward our bedroom. Half the closet was empty. His drawers, yanked open, some still dangling crookedly, had been stripped of everything. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint account. The number glared up at me. $143,000 withdrawn just 6 hours earlier, all in one transaction. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I pulled out a pad of paper and started a checklist. Lock credit cards, freeze bank accounts, call attorney, secure business assets. I paused on that last one. Business. I headed out to the backyard, flipping the patio lights on as I went. The spring air was crisp with the scent of jasmine vines that curled along our fence, vines I'd planted when Michael was in elementary school, to remind me of my father's garden. The fire pit was still warm. That's when I saw it, blackened corners of papers poking out between the logs, charred but not completely gone. I crouched down and pulled one free. My licensing agreement for our newest educational software program, signed, stamped, mine. Another scrap, my original designs for the adaptive learning algorithm that had revolutionized personalized education, still faintly visible through the burn. He hadn't just taken our money. He tried to erase my name from my own work. This man had watched me pull all-nighters for 20 years, seen me present prototypes, deal with school districts, pitch to investors. Now, without saying a single word, he tried to vanish it all into ash. I stood up slowly. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I walked back inside, poured a glass of water, and sat at my desk in the corner of our bedroom, my workspace for 2 decades. I clicked open a folder labeled insurance. It asked for a passcode. I entered it Michael's birthday combined with my father's death date. Inside were scanned copies of every contract, email thread, NDA, recording, time-stamped photo, and investor list spanning 20 years. I'd made it a habit to back up everything after the second time Thomas had accidentally deleted my files. The weight of 25 years of marriage and 20 years of business partnership settled over me, but my chest felt oddly calm, as if something ancient had shifted into place. I had let them rewrite me once, but this time, I'd be the one holding the pen. Flashback the pattern. The next morning, I didn't cry. I documented everything. I had slept perhaps 2 hours. By 5:30 a.m., I was already in the kitchen, watching daybreak paint the clouds pink while clutching a cold cup of coffee. Our house felt empty, not just because half of Thomas's things were gone, but because the silence echoed inside me, as if something buried for years was finally clawing its way up from beneath the floorboards. My phone vibrated. A message from my mother. Did you cause a scene, Maria? Not, are you okay? Not even, what happened? Just concern about appearances. At 82, Eleanor Howard still prioritized family harmony over truth, even when that harmony was a carefully constructed illusion. It was such a classic line that I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it anymore, nothing surprising. My mother had always favored Caroline's vibrant personality over my quieter approach. Why can't you present yourself better? She'd ask whenever I was overlooked for my more charismatic sister. The memories came unbidden. I was 37, launching the first version of our educational software. After months of development, the Regional Education Conference finally gave me a platform to present it. Caroline had wandered into my office the evening before, asking questions about the presentation, offering to help. You're so brilliant, Maria, but you get nervous in front of crowds. Let me help introduce you. The next morning, she arrived at the venue early. By the time I got there, she was halfway through presenting my work, my slides, my research, my coding, as though we developed it together. When questioned about technical specifications, she smoothly said, "My sister handles the technical side. I'm the vision behind the project." That night, my father had pulled me aside. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "You need to start keeping records of everything." That was the night he gave me the rosewood pin, telling me it represented quiet strength. Some people shine like sequins, Maria, but you're built of sturdier stuff. Or the time we celebrated Michael's acceptance to college. Thomas raised his glass to toast Caroline for always supporting our family's educational initiatives, even though the scholarship fund Michael received had been my creation from start to finish. When I mentioned this later, Thomas had shrugged. Caroline just presents these things better. It's good marketing. Every milestone of mine had been diluted, blurred, or outright stolen. I kept telling myself that being the bigger person was noble, that humility was strength, that love, even when unrequited, still counted for something. Maybe it did, but what it didn't do was protect me, because last night wasn't the first time Caroline had crossed the line with Thomas. I'd seen the signs 5 years ago, when our company expanded to international markets. Thomas began scheduling late meetings when Caroline was coincidentally in town. I'd caught her fixing his tie at a conference, her fingers lingering too long. The way she looked at me when I noticed, not guilty, but annoyed, as if I was interrupting something that belonged to her. I, naively, desperately, had chosen to believe Thomas when he said I was overreacting, that Caroline was just affectionate with everyone. For the sake of Michael, then in his freshman year of college, I had swallowed my suspicions. For the sake of my aging mother, who couldn't bear family conflict, I had maintained the peace. But sitting at my kitchen table that morning, I remembered something else, a therapy session about a year ago. I'd been exhausted, teetering on burnout after launching our latest educational platform. My friend had insisted I speak to someone. The therapist had asked, "Maria, do you feel invisible in your own marriage? In your own company?" I'd laughed then, shrugged it off. Now her words clung to me like fog on glass, not just invisible, but systematically erased. The counterattack begins. The clock on the wall read 7:12 a.m. when I opened my laptop. Emails had piled up overnight. a few notifications from my assistant Sarah, updates from our educational partners, and one flagged message forwarded at 2:34 a.m. It was from Sarah with the subject line, "You didn't authorize this, right?" I clicked it open. The message she had forwarded was from Caroline, sent using my name and business email. The signature was forged, identical except for the hyphen in my middle name, which I always omitted. The content was a revised licensing agreement for our flagship educational platform. Instead of routing royalties to our company, it redirected them to a shell entity in Caroline's name. It had been prepared and sent to the legal department just hours before the gala. This wasn't petty sabotage. This was calculated theft, filed with precision under the assumption that I was too soft, too loyal, or too blind to notice. I stared at the timestamp. 4:48 p.m. Before she even stepped into that ballroom wearing my mother's brooch, before she claimed my life's work as her own vision, she already thought she'd won. But here's the thing about underestimating someone like me. You assume silence means weakness. You assume forgiveness means defeat. But I had something Caroline never did: patience, documentation, and time. I wasn't just a discarded wife. I was a target, and they thought I'd never fight back. I grabbed my coat and headed downtown to the co-working space I occasionally used when I needed privacy away from the office. The receptionist, an older woman named Brenda who'd worked there for years, nodded with faint recognition. "Meeting room 2C, she said without my having to ask. Alan Fisher sat at the far end of the room. His suit was a soft gray, understated but firm, just like him. He'd been my father's colleague and friend for decades, now a semi-retired corporate attorney who specialized in intellectual property. He'd helped me structure the company when I first launched it at 37. "Maria," he greeted me with that same calm voice he'd always had. "You look like someone who's finally had enough." He gave a dry chuckle. "When you emailed me at 4 a.m. asking about silent transfers and forged signatures, I figured it wasn't just curiosity." I sat down, folding my hands on the table. "I need to know how deep they went," I said. "Thomas, Caroline, I think they're trying to take over everything." Alan didn't ask questions he didn't already know the answers to. He simply opened a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were printed records, paper still warm from the printer. 3 months ago, while I was at an educational conference in Arizona, no phone, no email, no outside contact, a power of attorney form had been submitted with my digital signature on it. It authorized Thomas to make temporary administrative decisions regarding equity structure and intellectual property licensing. In the weeks that followed, ownership shares in my company had been diluted, not drastically, but just enough to allow for what the document called strategic reallocation. My name had been pushed down the ownership hierarchy. Thomas and Caroline now held collective control. "You've got two choices," Alan said, his tone low. "Fight loud or fight smart." I exhaled slowly. "What does fighting smart look like?" He tilted his head. "Quiet audits, paper trails, evidence gathering, then timing your strike when they can't counter." "My father always said documentation was power," I said, thinking of Andrew's lessons. Alan smiled slightly. "Your father was a brilliant man. He also left you better protection than you might realize." I left with more papers than I could carry comfortably and a pounding behind my eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But I did go home and dig through old belongings. In a box in the back of my closet, under layers of scarves and journals from when Michael was young, I found an old USB stick labeled Hemlock Genesis 2005. It was dusty, nearly forgotten, but the moment I plugged it into my laptop, the file loaded instantly. It contained footage from the earliest days of our company, a meeting in the spare bedroom that served as my first office, back when I believed Thomas and I were building something together. The video quality was grainy, but the audio crystal clear. Caroline's voice rang out, laughing. "You just have to keep her busy with the technical side and those educational ideals she's so passionate about. Maria's not the type to push for recognition. That's what makes her useful." In the frame, Thomas smiled and sipped his beer. "She keeps the engines running. We take the wheel when it matters." I didn't move. Didn't breathe. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated exploitation. The file timestamp showed it was saved the same week I finalized our initial business structure. The same week Caroline had given me that expensive planner and called me the soul of our educational mission. I backed up the video to 3 separate drives and uploaded it to a secure cloud. Then I deleted every trace from the original USB, reformatting it before returning it to the box. If they ever went looking, they'd find nothing. Then I walked to the mirror in my hallway, the same one I passed every morning but hadn't truly looked into in months. There I was, same dark hair now streaked with silver, same determined eyes, but the woman staring back had something else now: clarity. They want a version of me that doesn't exist anymore, I said aloud. The silence that followed felt clean, purifying. By late afternoon, I'd booked a one-way ticket to Mendocino. To think, I told my mother when she texted again, concerned that I'd missed a family lunch. Going up the coast to clear my head. No signal, don't worry. But I wasn't going to think. I was going to plan. I wasn't running. I was rising. I'd booked a one-way ticket, but not to escape. I was about to become the version of myself they'd hoped would stay buried forever. In Mendocino, the Mendocino coastline stretched beneath my window like a living watercolor, cool grays and restless blues melting into each other. I stood in the tiny rental cottage, holding a coffee mug as if it might warm more than just my hands. It didn't. My unpacked bag slouched beside the armchair like I felt inside. I knelt to zip it properly, and something caught, wedged between 2 journals. A letter, my name written in my father's deliberate handwriting. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the strange certainty that whatever it contained would matter. I opened it slowly. Maria, if you're reading this, then it means time has done what it does. I always told you to be kind, but not blind. Love is not a license for abuse, and those closest to you will often dress theft as care. Document everything. Protect your name. Enclosed is a notarized copy of your company's leadership succession clause. I witnessed it myself when we restructured after the international expansion. I love you. Stay sharp, Dad. I let the letter fall gently into my lap. The weight of his words pressed harder than grief had when we buried him 10 years ago. His voice echoed in my chest, firm, protective, always just ahead of the storm. I folded the clause twice and slid it into my laptop sleeve. It felt like a weapon sheathed in cotton. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The lines blurred. I curled up on the worn couch, knees to chest, still in yesterday's clothes. I let the tears come, not for them, but for me. For the woman I had silenced in the name of keeping peace. For the parts of me I had handed over to people who smiled with their teeth but spoke with knives. I thought about my mother, now frail at 82, who had always chosen the path of least resistance. Don't make waves, Maria, she'd say whenever Caroline took credit for my accomplishments. She needs the attention more than you do. I thought about Thomas, who had once helped me code late into the night, amazed at what we were creating before success made him hungry for more recognition than he'd earned. I wiped my cheeks and sat up straighter. No more. I pulled out my phone and called Alan. I found it, I said when he answered. The succession clause my father had notarized. Ah, he replied, satisfaction evident in his voice. Andrew always did think ahead. Want to hear something interesting? Your sister tried to access your company's administrative permissions again this morning. The system flagged it because of the monitoring we put in place. What was she trying to do? Move funds from your educational foundation to the shell company. $50,000. I smiled. Not from joy, but from confirmation. Let's proceed with the audit. Already underway. And Maria? Your father would be proud. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The confrontation, Oakland rooftop. The next day, I drove down the coast without telling anyone where I was going. I dressed in black, simple, sharp, a suit I'd bought for presenting to international investors, but had rarely worn because Thomas always said it made me look too assertive. By the time I stepped onto the rooftop restaurant in Oakland, the sun was beginning to tilt toward dusk. The city buzzed below like a secret everyone was in on. Thomas and Caroline sat at the long table, surrounded by people in polished shoes and designer watches, our company's executive team and potential investors. The clink of silverware and hum of practiced laughter created the perfect backdrop for their performance. I didn't wait to be seen. I walked up and stood at the head of the table. It took 3 seconds for Thomas to notice me. His jaw tightened. Caroline's eyebrows arched, but she didn't flinch. "Maria," she said, tone too smooth. "What a surprise. I figured I'd drop by," I replied, reaching for an empty glass. This looked like a celebration. Thomas half stood, his expression shifting from shock to controlled anger. "We're in the middle of a private to long games," I interrupted, raising the glass, "and short memories." Caroline's smile twitched at the corners. I reached into my purse, pulled out a napkin, and placed it in front of Thomas. Folded neatly on it was a printed image of the forged signature from the transfer form. It was off by just one letter, an L swapped for a capital I in my middle name. Something a stranger wouldn't catch. Something a sister should have known better than to fake. "Tell Caroline," I said calmly, "that next time she signs my name, she should spell it correctly." The table went silent. Someone dropped a fork with a clatter that seemed to echo across the rooftop. I didn't wait for replies. I turned and walked away, my heels steady on the concrete. No shouting, no slaps, no dramatic scene, just a napkin, a quiet statement, and a truth too sharp to ignore. The elevator doors opened as I approached. I didn't look back, but I could feel their stares burning between my shoulder blades. I knew what would come next. So did they. But what they didn't know was that their next move was predictable, while I had already made mine 3 days ago. The virtual boardroom. By the time the boardroom filled with murmurs and the scent of polished wood in San Francisco's financial district the following week, I had already been awake for hours. I didn't fly in. I didn't need to. A well-timed virtual entrance would say more than any pair of heels ever could. They'd chosen to meet without me, as if I'd already been written out of my own company's story. But I knew Thomas. I knew how he operated after 25 years of marriage. First bluff, then posture, follow with charm, and finish with pressure. I watched through my laptop camera as he stood at the front of the conference table in our headquarters, gesturing to slides that painted himself as the strategic genius behind Hemlock Educational Software, my code, my vision, my late nights, and sacrificed weekends with my son. As we move into this new chapter, Thomas was saying, the leadership transition we began 3 months ago will allow us to focus on more aggressive market expansion rather than just educational outcomes. That was my cue. I clicked Join Meeting. The screen behind Thomas flickered once, then my face appeared, larger than life. He froze, hands suspended mid-gesture. Even through the video feed, I could see the color drain from his face. "Good morning," I said evenly. "I believe I'm still listed as founder and majority shareholder if we're splitting hairs." Dead silence, then a cough. Without another word, I uploaded the notarized succession clause directly into the meeting's shared drive, dated 5 years ago, witnessed by Andrew Howard, former professor of education and board member emeritus. My father. One of our longest-serving board members, Marlene Whitaker, leaned forward and squinted at her tablet. Her brows drew together as she read. "Why weren't we informed about this clause?" she asked. Thomas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His neck flushed red. "Because," I replied without raising my voice, "no one asked who built the company. You only asked who signed the checks." Marlene's lips pressed together. Then she nodded, and just like that, my seat at the table I had built, was no longer up for debate. After the call ended, I opened a secure browser and filed the legal motion Alan had prepared. The joint business account Thomas and I had established when we merged assets for Hemlock. He always said transparency builds trust. Turns out he meant my transparency, not his. My motion cited forgery, unauthorized signature usage, and breach of fiduciary duty. I attached the relevant files, logs, and a flagged timestamp showing digital tampering from Caroline's device. The bank's compliance team acted swiftly. 3 hours later, I received confirmation. Account status frozen. A minute after that, Caroline tried to move $50,000 from the Educational Foundation's media budget line. Her screen would have blinked with the message, "Access denied. Legal hold authority, M. Howard." I imagined the look on her face, the clenched jaw, the manicured finger tapping her phone screen in disbelief. Somewhere in her penthouse with its careful arrangements of fresh flowers and imported teas, my little sister was finally learning what it felt like to lose. Thomas texted at 11:47 a.m. "You've made your point. Back down before this gets ugly." I stared at the screen, then typed, "You're mistaken. That wasn't my point. That was just the introduction. No emoji, no signature, just facts." I scrolled to the contacts saved under Dad's office. Not my father, of course. He'd been gone for 10 years now. But his longtime associate, Alan Fisher, who had become my legal advisor. He'd always said, "Corruption leaves fingerprints. You just have to know where to dust." I called. He picked up on the second ring. "Maria, I need help reviewing some asset movements," I said. "And I have a list of board votes that, well, they feel more like patterns than strategy." His tone changed. "I'm listening." We set a time. Later that day, I took a slow drive along the coast. The traffic gave way to winding turns and sun-dappled silence beneath the redwoods. I rolled the window down, let the breeze comb through my hair. A voicemail I hadn't played in years surfaced from my saved archive. It was my father. His voice crackled with that calm certainty that never faltered, not even in his final months. "You are not hard to love, sweetheart. You are hard to fool, and that's a blessing in the right hands." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until that moment. My hands tightened on the wheel, and for the first time in years, I smiled without pain trailing behind it. They had tried to erase me from every decision, but the woman they erased had just become the shadow behind every consequence. The courthouse battle. The San Francisco County Courthouse loomed before me, its granite facade gleaming in the morning light. I'd slept perhaps 3 hours, my mind racing with preparations. My father's rosewood pin was fastened to my charcoal blazer, a talisman of sorts, a connection to his wisdom when I needed it most. I hadn't expected the envelope under my windshield, hadn't anticipated they would go after Michael. But in retrospect, I should have seen it coming. When people like Thomas and Caroline lose power, they escalate. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into courtroom 4B, jaw locked and breath steady. The room was half filled, mostly lawyers and quiet observers, but it might as well have been a stadium. Across the aisle, Thomas and Caroline sat shoulder to shoulder, their attorneys flipping through glossy presentation folders. They didn't glance my way, a choreographed show of indifference. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen through more lies than she ever bothered counting, called the hearing to order. The first blow landed fast. Thomas's lawyer presented a printed copy of therapy notes dated 6 months earlier, concerns extracted from a session that was never meant to be shared. I recognized the handwriting immediately, my therapist, and knew Caroline had somehow obtained these confidential records. Given her recent isolation, erratic behavior, and questionable business decisions, the lawyer argued smoothly. "We have serious concerns about Michael's well-being." Caroline added her performance, voice trembling with practiced concern. "She hasn't let anyone see him in weeks. We're family. We're just trying to protect him." I thought of Michael, now 21 and in his junior year of college, who had called me just yesterday, worried about his tuition payment that had mysteriously been delayed. How convenient that Thomas had tried to freeze his son's education funds right before this hearing. When my turn came, I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the folder Alan had helped me prepare, the one that had been locked in my father's safe for years. His estate attorney had handed it to me the week after his funeral with a single instruction: "Only open if they ever come for what you love most." Inside was everything: a notarized guardianship letter naming me sole legal and financial guardian for Michael, documentation of Thomas's past threats including a recorded statement where he'd said, "If you don't back down, I'll make sure you lose everything, including him." But what silenced the room was the trust clause signed by my father, witnessed and sealed 10 years ago. It stated clearly that if any family member attempted to sabotage or defame me for financial gain, All inherited assets and company shares would be rerouted to me as trustee. Full control. No contestation. The judge read silently, her lips tightening with each page. Finally, she looked up, her gaze moving from Thomas to Caroline before settling on me. All claims denied, she said, her voice calm but final. And you too, she added, looking at my sister and husband, may want to retain separate counsel moving forward. This proceeding is adjourned. Caroline blinked rapidly, as if someone had slapped her without touching her. Thomas didn't move, his expression frozen in disbelief. Outside, the world had shifted. Reporters gathered as the courtroom doors opened. Ms. Howard, is it true they tried to take control of your son's trust fund? Maria, how long were these legal threats going on? I didn't answer. I spotted Michael waiting by the stairs, his tall frame reminiscent of Thomas in his younger days, but his eyes, thoughtful, observant, were all mine. He reached for my hand, his fingers wrapping around mine like he used to do as a child. Are we good? He asked quietly. I looked up at the sky, blue and wide above the plaza. Yes, I said. We are. Aftermath and reflection. That evening, when the courthouse dust had settled and the press vans cleared away, I sat alone on my back porch. The sunlight stretched long across the wooden planks, and my father's rosewood pin caught a slant of gold light, the grain glinting with warmth. They danced like I wasn't there, I whispered, more to the wind than to anyone else. But I was the one who built the floor they danced on. I just decided to pull it out from under them. Quietly. The moment lingered, whole and perfect in its completion. Thomas's law firm released a statement that same afternoon. Internal ethics review launched. Caroline's foundation page went dark by evening, most corporate sponsors pulling out within hours after the court documents became public. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Then came a knock at the door, not sharp or urgent, just familiar. When I opened it, there was no one there, just a single envelope on the welcome mat. Cream-colored, aged at the edges, my name written in a hand I hadn't seen in years. It was from my mother. The delicate script I remembered from childhood, curved letters with hesitant pauses, as if Eleanor had always been unsure how much space she was allowed to take up on the page. My name was spelled in full this time, not the clipped M she used when she was upset. The envelope was postmarked from nearly 2 years ago. Somehow it had been buried beneath a stack of probate documents from my father's estate, sealed, misfiled, then found only weeks after today's courtroom confrontation. I didn't open it right away. I waited until the following day, when I was sitting on a weathered bench overlooking the sea in Monterey. The Pacific crashed below like it had something important to say, but didn't care if anyone listened. The late afternoon sun cast that golden hue that somehow softens even the sharpest memories into something almost kind. The letter wasn't an apology. It was something far more dangerous. Honesty. Caroline needed more attention, or so I thought, maybe because she was louder about it. You always stood on your own, even as a child. But now I see that standing alone doesn't mean you're not breaking inside. I should have seen that. I should have seen you. I was afraid of your strength, Maria, because it showed me everything I wasn't. Your father always understood you better than I did. He was proud of you in ways I didn't know how to express. There were no grand confessions, no pleas for forgiveness, just a truth whispered too late. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was the closest my mother and I would ever come. At 82, she probably wouldn't even remember writing it. A new beginning. A month passed. Thomas left the country the next day after the court hearing, citing professional opportunities abroad. In reality, he was dodging subpoenas. Caroline had gone quiet too, her foundation's website displaying only a curt statement, pausing operations for personal reflection. Translation. The donors pulled out, the scandal grew teeth, and no one wanted to be seen holding hands with fraud. But I didn't follow their stories anymore. I had other things to build. The counseling center we launched 2 weeks ago bore my father's name, the Howard House for Educational Empowerment. It occupied an old converted coastal building surrounded by native gardens and shaded by tall eucalyptus trees, the kind of peaceful setting my father had always loved. We didn't take grand opening photos or post stories online. People came when they were ready. We were there when they arrived. I used a portion of the reclaimed estate funds to establish its first 2 years of operation. No fanfare, no headlines, just a single logo above the entrance. A rosewood pin carved into the shape of a flame. Steady, not fierce. Some of the women who came through our doors, educators, entrepreneurs, mothers returning to the workforce, recognized the symbol from my father's academic papers on educational equality. Most didn't. That was okay. It wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about rebuilding. Today, Michael sat beside me on the beach near the center. He was drawing something in the sand with a piece of driftwood while I let the sea wind tangle my hair. He decided to take a semester off from his business degree to help establish the center's mentorship program for first-generation college students. This stick reminded me of Grandpa's pin, he said, glancing up at me. I looked at the piece of rosewood he'd found near the tide line, small, imperfect, bent slightly in the middle, like it had survived something but still chose to keep growing. It does look like it, I smiled. It reminds me that we can grow again from where we were broken. He laid the stick next to my shoe, careful, as if it were something sacred. At 21, he had his father's height but his grandfather's thoughtfulness. I wondered what Andrew would think of the man his grandson was becoming. A seagull called overhead. A couple wandered by with their dog. Somewhere behind us, wind chimes from a beachfront cafe played something faint and slightly out of tune. I didn't need music anymore, or crowds, or even validation. What I had now was quiet, not the kind that leaves you lonely, but the kind you earn. The kind that comes when the fight is over and you're finally able to sit peacefully in your own life, uninvited by anyone, unwanted by none, because you built this part, every inch of it. I ran my fingers along the edge of my journal. The rosewood pin sat inside the front cover now, its weight grounding, not burdensome. At 57, I had learned what took my mother a lifetime to understand. Sometimes when the music fades and the crowd vanishes, what's left is what was always most valuable. Mom? Michael's voice pulled me back to the present. I've been thinking about rebuilding the educational app with a new team. Fresh start, new code, but the same mission. I smiled at him. Your grandfather would have loved that. What about you? After everything that happened with Dad and Aunt Caroline? I looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a perfect line of possibility. I think, I said slowly, feeling the truth of the words as they formed, that at 57, I'm just getting started.